Hello, and thanks for joining us on the first episode of Season 6 of Driving into the Future, a post-media driving production that brings together automotive industry experts to discuss important issues facing the personal transportation sector. And boy, are there issues. Powertrains have become politicized. The Western world's automotive industry is facing an existential crisis from the East, and Canada's great friend and closest neighbor is threatening economic sanctions that could cripple our domestic automotive manufacturing business. My name is Andrew McCready, a senior editor with Driving, and I'll be the moderator of this one-hour event. We've assembled a quartet of extremely knowledgeable guests tasked with the somewhat unenviable position of making sense of where the automotive industry has been in the last year and predicting where it will go in the future. They are Scott McKenzie, Director, Corporate and External Affairs, Toyota Canada; Joseph McCabe, President and CEO, Auto Forecast Solutions, LLC; Timothy Kane, founder and former editor of Good Car, Bad Car. He's a contributing sales analyst here at Driving; and David Booth, senior writer, Driving, and Motormouth columnist. Okay, let's get underway here. Since this panel is all about the state of the auto industry, let's start with Tim and some of that wonderful data that you deal in. What were the major car shopping trends in Canada in 2024, Tim?
Good morning, Andrew. For all its abnormalities, 2024 in some ways was actually a little bit normal for the Canadian auto industry. It's going to take me a minute to explain that. There were obviously still persistent issues with supply chain and inventory, but in some ways, 2024 did mark a return to some normality. I don't mean normal in the sense that everything was the way that it used to be 5 or 10 or 20 years ago. Premium brands now account for 14% of the market, not 7% as they did 20 years ago. Full-size pickups are obviously a much bigger factor at roughly 17% of the market, not 11% as they were 15 years ago. Passenger cars, this is the big one, now account for less than 15% of all new vehicle sales, which was roughly 42% just 10 years ago. EVs, obviously, our big story, now accounting for 1 out of every 10 new vehicle sales, not 2 out of every 100 as they did just 5 years ago pre-pandemic. So while the types of vehicles have changed, what was distinctly normal was the number of new vehicles driven home. After a 4-year period of this chronic instability, Canadians acquired 1.86 million new vehicles in 2024, which is almost identical to the number of vehicles from the 10-year average leading into the pandemic. So there are more people in this country now, so the per capita vehicle sales rate is obviously lower, but in terms of the number of vehicles being sold, dealers are kind of back to where they were accustomed to, selling roughly 36,000 vehicles per week. One difference being that it's 36,000 vehicles per week on average, but at transaction prices in the 50s and 60s on average, as opposed to the 30s and 40s like it used to be.
So would you say that the dealer inventory, there were all these problems with supply during the pandemic. Are we back to pre-pandemic numbers now in terms of the availability of new vehicles for Canadians?
No, in this country, we're not back to normal, but that varies greatly by brand. So if you're talking about something like a Toyota Tacoma or a Kia Carnival, no, we're not seeing levels the likes of which we were accustomed to. But at certain brands, certainly the domestics, we're starting to see a lot more normality on inventory.
Thanks, Tim. Well, it's great to have one of those aforementioned neighbors to the south on the panel, Joe. A warm welcome to you. Your company, Auto Forecast Solution, has projected sales and production figures for Canada right up to 2031. Any surprises in that? As Tim said, we're kind of year over year, it's kind of the same models being the same segments up to 2031. Is that going to change?
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Surprises, that's its own question, right? Let's just talk about some raw numbers and we can, discuss it from that perspective. I mean, in terms of production of vehicles that are planned to be built this year in Canada that have a plug-in hybrid, extended range, BEV, you're talking about a third of all the vehicles. However, a subset of that is a pure BEV. We're just north of 5%. If we extrapolate that all the way out to the end of the decade, we're actually at nearly three-fourths of all vehicles built in Canada will have a plug. And only about 27% right now, total, will be BEV. Now, that's where the fluidity plays the mark, right? A lot of people look at the plans, obviously with the new Trump leadership in the United States, on how they may recalibrate that balance of plugs. Could it possibly come down and be less on the BEV and more plug and also non-plug hybrids, or more standard hybrids? We're seeing that's where the fluidity of it. If we had to pick the sort of ranking, the BEV leader in production in Canada by the end of the decade is Honda. The plug-in hybrid leader from a production volume standpoint is Stellantis, and the standard hybrid, meaning no plug, regenerative braking, things of that nature, is going to be Toyota. So there is a nice balance of the 5 manufacturers that are building there. It is a nice balance of the 3 are basically going to kind of sort of understand their segments are. They're all taking a different approach, mind you, on how they're going to get it. We always said that, Toyota always gets it right. And, looking at it critically, sitting back and saying, how should we approach this market? We don't want to run into this burning BEV building. We never drank the BEV Kool-Aid. We think BEVs are a one arrow in the quiver of a propulsion production strategy. It's not the only solution. And at the end of the day, when you look at a BEV, there's one thing a manufacturer has to figure out: how to make a plug not a disruptor to the consumer. If you take cost, everything else, infrastructure, get your Excel spreadsheet out and say how much you're going to save on gas, that's great. But that plug is deemed a disruptor in that consumer's life, they will not buy it. Simple as that. And that's the real crux of what's going to happen over the next 8 to 10 years. How do you get over that? Now, with the Trump administration coming in, I do think we're going to see dialing back. I think Honda is aggressive in their BEV strategy. I think they might dial that back a little bit. They are talking to Nissan, and that story in the works kind of thing about how they can sort of balance out their BEV and hybridization strategy. So it's definitely a fluid market, but at the end of the story, BEVs are here. They're here to stay. It just determines on how much they're here to stay over the next decade.
One of the big things when kind of predicting in an ICE engine is kind of easy because they've been around 100 years. Battery technology changes. I mean, not even every year, probably every month, things are improving. So do you bake in something when you're predicting for a lower cost battery electric?
Yeah, I mean, we have to always put in, there's always going to be innovation. There's always new players going, please buy my innovation before I go bankrupt, kind of thing. And you'll get absorbed by someone bigger to basically take that in. I think we're at the infancy. Yes, we have lithium, but then we have sodium, and we have graphene, and we have solid state coming. There's a litany of things that are really going to come down the path to bring that cost down. And that is obviously a biggest problem, right? You have a floor. You can't just have a battery at zero. I mean, you have to have a cost to build this thing. And when all of the raw materials and manufacturing costs to make that battery are expensive, well, then you're stuck with that cost. But again, that's the second hurdle from our perspective. It's not just cost. I mean, you see manufacturers right now, we'll get into it, they're just giving away vehicles on leasing just to get these BEVs off their lot right this second. And they're not flying off the lot. So this is not just a cost conversation. Yes, there's got a lot of technology coming, a lot of things on the move. But I mean, I'm telling you, this tipping point of 100% BEV by 35 or even 50, it makes no logical sense to us. It's here to stay. We're going to have a really nice balanced portfolio. You just got to get there over time.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, Scott, it's always great to see you, and we appreciate the insights you provide from the world of producing automobiles. How was the year 2024 in terms of the business of building vehicles?
Pretty busy. This past year in Canada specifically, Toyota produced more than 533,000 vehicles at our 3 plants in southwestern Ontario. That's a busy year. It's the most we've produced since 2018. It's above our natural capacity, meaning we're running overtime consistently. And frankly speaking, that will be our plan for the next few years as well. We've got an ideal model mix. We've got 1 Toyota product, the RAV4, and 2 Lexus products, the NX and the RX, that are very desirable in the marketplace right now. We do offer hybrid versions of each, and each year our proportion of hybrids is increasing, both in Canada and also our export vehicles going to the US. So, honestly speaking, we're in a pretty good spot. We're busy. Things are going well, and we'll keep at it.
So, as I said in the introduction there, storm clouds are gathering in a sense in the automotive industry. What keeps a guy like you up at night?
Yeah, as a producer, as a producer of vehicles, honestly, you want certainty, and you don't want volatility. We want to have a pretty clear runway. We want to know what we're going to make. We need to know what the market's going to look like. We need to know what demand's going to look like. And left to our own devices, I think we'd be in pretty good shape. Obviously, there are some things externally that may influence that. And, as a planner looking at things down the road, and Joe just talked about, what certain OEMs might be making at some point in the future. You also want that certainty, but we've got things that influence the marketplace. You've got regulation, and that could be whether it's pertaining to battery electric vehicles or electrification in general. But you've also got laws, and that could be trade rules. And you have to account for all of those things. And right now, frankly speaking, we're in a really volatile environment, and anyone, and no disrespect to Joe, but anyone, thinking that they have a crystal ball for, 2028, 2029, 2030, is probably, not going to end up being accurate.
Well, where would we be without predictions? That's what our cachet is. And speaking of which, thanks for that, Scott, by the way. And we'll get into more of the things that are facing manufacturers, the uncertainty, as you mentioned. David, okay, we'll turn our attention to the future with you. You've been busy chronicling the many issues facing the auto industry in your weekly Motormouth column and podcast at Driving.ca. What do you think is the most pressing issue for the automotive segment in North America? Political volatility, possible tariffs, disappearing EV incentives, autonomous vehicles? There's lots to think about.
Well, I think the subject, I can tell you what's dead: autonomous vehicles. I mean, all the surveys say people don't want them. They want driver aid systems. They also want some control of their own car. Besides that, Elon Musk's plan to take over the government regulation of EVs and set up his own regulations for robo-taxis is going to be problematic. In fact, the Treasury Secretary just recently, Transportation Secretary just said that they're going to continue investigating his autopilot and full self-driving accidents. So that's done. Surprisingly, we don't hear about China tariffs anymore. I mean, amazing, right? I mean, 3-4 months ago, the world was, it was the biggest news in Canada. It was the biggest news in the automotive world in the States. Trump gets reelected, and oh boy, we got new problems. Speaking of which, the immediate problem is, of course, the tariffs. We don't know when they're coming. He says February 1st. There are discussions there. It could be April 1st. It could be 10%. It could be 25%. The problem is we don't know, but we have to take it seriously. The one thing I'll say is that Mr. Trump and his advisors are much better organized in 2024 than they are in 2016. We need to take them seriously. And then, of course, there's EV mandates and EV incentives. And they're changing as we speak. EV incentives in Canada just got dropped. They're probably going to get choked off down the States. In here in Canada, Poilievre will definitely get rid of the EV mandate that is federal. Trump is going to fool with the EPA to reduce emission standards, to reduce the quasi-EV mandate in the States. He's also going to chase after California's waiver to create its own EV mandate. That's a whole boatload, and we're going to discuss some of those after. The most important thing, though, is something that both Joe and Scott said, is all this toing and froing, all this politicization, all this Biden has a tight emission standard. Trump gets rid of it all. Trudeau has an EV mandate. Poilievre automatically disbands the whole thing. That political instability as it affects the auto industry is very difficult. It's going to hurt the EV transition. It's going to hurt all planning. It's going to hurt model selection. It's going to hurt everything, because automakers simply can't change their long-term product planning every 4 years. You can't create the EV strategy, for instance, that's going to have to get us from now till 2035 if you really want to have a 2035 mandate for all electric. If every election cycle it goes to a different political party, which will either return an EV mandate or scrap an EV mandate. So I'd say that instability going forward is the biggest problem we have today.
Thanks, David. So, Tim, as David noted, provincial and federal election vehicle incentives are ending, have ended, or are ending, I guess. That must be very difficult for dealerships. Obviously, they have, they help the people get rebates in the point of sale. So what are dealerships doing about this uncertainty? How are they reacting?
Yeah, it's a good question, Andrew. I think it's possible the general public wasn't aware that incentives couldn't last forever. I think we knew that there was eventually going to be a wind down. I think what no one expected was that there'd be a wind down between a Friday afternoon and a Monday morning. And so as a result, you have these prospective buyers, likely buyers, people who were quite possibly in the act of buying, who were left without a $5,000 government incentive, which is a lot of money on something like a Hyundai Kona, which is a pretty popular EV in Canada. That's roughly 10% of its value. So the thing is, the odds are that there would have been people literally in the act of buying last Monday morning. EVs have become pretty popular over the last 24 to 36 months. So on any average work day, Canadians could be buying roughly 600 EVs, which is a pretty big number. That number maybe would be lower on a typical Monday morning in the middle of January, but one way or another, there were sales that were likely about to occur, especially given that Friday announcement, without paperwork having been submitted to the federal ISIV program, for which the federal government says they are making zero exceptions. So there are automakers making exceptions, first because they want to keep the customer satisfied, and second because they really need to move metal, especially of the 2024 variety. So Volkswagen, as an example of what Joe had earlier talked about, the fact that EVs aren't moving at the rate that the dealers and manufacturers want them to, Volkswagen's bonus credit in response to this EV incentive reduction is $10,000. They're also offering 0% financing over 60 months. They obviously need to move 2024 ID4s. Nissan's matching the federal rebate on Aria, although not the Leaf. Ford wants to help customers get through what they're calling a transition. So with Mustang Mach-E, Escape PHEV, some versions of the Lightning, Lincoln Corsair. Hyundai matching the government's $5,000 rebate until the end of January. GM providing a $5,000 matching incentive for Equinox and Blazer between January 3rd for what they call customers from January 13th to 31st. So it's fair to ask whether this rebate matching will end on February 1st because all of these announcements have been related to January 31st. And that's possible. But this is basically now just becoming a new incentive scheme for OEMs, not unlike any incentive scheme that they'd offer on a monthly basis. And the structure of those incentive schemes are always linked to month end, so to something like January 31st. That said, GM, as an example, according to Automotive News, says that manufacturer-led incentives into February and beyond are not sustainable. Ford says that this January incentive not intended to be permanent. Hyundai says that they want to stick with their strategy, but to have a viable business, they say the level of incentive and support is required by government. So it's fair to say on the one hand, maybe these incentives disappear on January 31st. It's fair to say that if the cars need to move, incentives are going to have to stick in order for manufacturers to move the metal.
Thanks, Tim. So, Joe, same question for you, though through the lens of the United States market. Is that what Tim just described that's happening in Canada with dealers kind of, offering incentives to see this through? Is that happening in the States?
It is, but first, I'm going to cry offline after Scott told my crystal ball's no good. But anyway, all joking aside, and I want to actually support exactly what he said real quick. We have news coming in so hot off the presses in this industry. We've never seen an industry like this. For example, Stellantis had just made an announcement that they're going to put a mid-size pickup truck in Belvedere. I mean, I've been in this business for 30 years, and the volatility of news on a daily basis of strategy changing on a vehicle that's very difficult to build in a tomorrow time frame. Those constantly push and pull things are insane. But Scott's absolutely correct in the fact that the volatility, we just have never seen it in this climate before in our career. To talk to Tim, yeah, he's absolutely right. I mean, we always look at a government incentive as having a three strategy approach. Number one, it lights a fuse, and the government can walk away and it has a life of its own. That's not this. Or they put it out there and immediately take it out and it falls off a cliff. It's not that. We think basically it's right in the middle where it was enough to inspire people to get involved, and now they're taking electrification seriously. We honestly saw the incentive though is all allows to do is allow the manufacturer to raise their price by the $5,000 or $7,500. That was their how are we going to make profit when the only profit maker in this business is Tesla and companies like BYD in China. How do we make money in this business? So when you pull this incentive away, that is correct. This is not a long-term strategy. The vehicle manufacturers will have to bridge that gap and offer that incentive for themselves, which only hurts their number one customer, the shareholder. So this is where we got to look at this real, how we can survive for the next 30, 60, 90 days with a manufacturer putting that incentive. There is a ton of inventory on the lots. Rams, Jeeps have a ton of inventory on the lots. They have to move that metal. And we're going to see a lot different strategies, a bigger leasing strategy. Please take our vehicles at a lower price. Which I think is going to have a bubble in 3 years. Not trying to be a doom and gloom, but every time there's some sort of a pro, there's a lot of cons that go with it right next to it. So we are curious about what's going to happen over the next 12 months when the incentive comes out. We are not calling for a decline of BEVs. We're more of calling for a stabilization of those that are considering it. At the same time, vehicle manufacturers extending existing vehicle programs in the ICE space that are making them money, which then pushes out the next BEV program to another like 27 and 28 and 29 timeframe.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, Scott, so EV incentives are gone, but for now, EV mandates, at least in Canada, federally, we have a mandate. Quebec has a mandate. BC has a mandate. These mandates set a date in which automakers will be financially punished for selling new gasoline-powered vehicles. These are still on the books. So how does an automaker cope with that in Canada in terms of kind of projecting to 2035? It's how do you product plan under that kind of environment?
Yeah, again, it's pretty challenging. We've been speaking to governments, both the federal governments and then the provincial governments in BC and Quebec primarily, around the concept of ZEV mandates, for several years now. And, when we're speaking to governments, we like to explain that there's really 4 necessary conditions that need to be in place for someone to buy an EV. And the first is that, it's affordability. Can they afford to purchase it? Can they, afford to run it? They also need to be able to charge it. And I would argue that primarily that's charging at home. I don't think, charging or relying on public charging infrastructure 100% of the time is a good strategy. Also has to be able to meet their lifestyle and also their day-to-day needs, and it needs to be available. And when I say available, the infrastructure for building EVs is still being built out across North America and even globally, and you'll have more models in segments that maybe appeal to you appearing over time, but it will take a little bit of time. And then, I think governments broadly understand that. And, you can see that in the first 2, whether it be purchase incentives and also programs to support charging infrastructure, the governments have been very supportive. The purchase incentives, you've got federal incentives, $5,000. And I will add that we're also supporting, that shortfall on the BZ4X in Canada. But you've got purchase incentives provincially and federally that I would say all of them are at risk. The federal has been suspended. Quebec will be suspended shortly. And then BC is still, plugging along, but, the access has been restricted somewhat over the last year. So it does make it challenging. And, one thing to mention is a lot of the planning for purchase incentives was based on an assumption that EVs would reach price parity with internal combustion engine vehicles. And certain publications have been predicting that, over the last, honestly, 5 years, and they've been consistently wrong. And they keep on missing or pushing out that projection to some time in the future. I think today they're projecting around 2028. It was 2025. Before that, it was 2022. We're clearly not there yet. And I can say with confidence that, governments were using that for their planning. So they didn't think that they would have to offer purchase incentives beyond a certain point in time. And federally, that was 2025. Governments have spent, frankly, billions of dollars on incentives, and it's absolutely helped, but I don't think that's sustainable in the long term. So we were always going to come to this day. It just depended, when it would actually happen.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Scott. So David, Okay, EV incentives, let's just say they're gone temporarily, possibly permanently. It's, it's kind of in a sense, it's time for EVs to stand on their own. We'll see how that happens. But is that loss the only headwind facing the auto industry 2 days after US President Trump was inaugurated?
Looking looking at the North American industry as a whole, there are basically four pillars for the EV transition. EV incentives in Canada, EV incentives in the United States, the federal tax credit of $7,500 south of the border, the federal EV mandate here in Canada, and California's quasi mandate for America because 14 states follow California, representing about almost half their sales. So it works into a de facto EV mandate for at least half of America. Those are the four pillars. Well, the federal incentives are already gone, and the Liberals aren't getting reelected, and that's not coming back. The American tax credit is under threat from Donald Trump. That's one of his prime prerogatives, is to get that out of there. From what I understand, he can't get rid of it easily, like with just signing an executive order, but he can choke it off. So there's two pillars almost assuredly gone. The third pillar I'd talk about is Canada's EV mandate. Our Prime Minister-elect, as it were, Pierre Poilievre, has almost assured that he's going to get rid of our EV mandate. There's three of the four pillars. The real argument, I'd say, long-term for EVs is Trump wants to get rid of California's right to create its own EV mandate. And lots of people have tried before. I would say that there's a much better chance that's happening now. Where previous attempts might be a 2% chance to get it before the courts, I'd say it's somewhere in the 30-40% range now. If you're interested in the subject, you better start learning stuff about major questions doctrine and state sovereignty, for instance, because that's going to become big news in the next little while. The problem for Canada for that is if the other three are gone and California goes, California is the spiritual home of the EV, if not in the world, certainly in North America. And if it goes, and it will take some time, it'll take 2 or 3 years, but if it goes, all the planning that people are doing, all of it is going to go out the window, I think. And I mean, just for instance, Tesla says it doesn't care if EV incentives goes away. They really do care if the California mandates go away, because they make about $2 billion a year these days on regulatory credits that the other manufacturers buy off them. Last I looked, the last quarter I looked, it was about 37 or 38% of all their net profit comes from other car companies buying credits from them. And that goes away with the California EV mandate, if it goes away. So yes, it's not a guaranteed thing like the other three, but it's a very distinct possibility. If all those four pillars go away, the entire notion of what we're doing with EVs is going to diminish quite significantly, I think.
Thank you, David. Tim, Trump has backed away off his tariffs for now. I mean, there's talk of them, but nothing solid. But the threat is still front and center for our industry. But while tariffs might be something novel for those new to the auto industry, this is hardly the first time that protectionism has affected the sector. What do tariffs of the past tell us about what might happen next?
It's a good question, Andrew. It's a big question, and so it's hard to answer too succinctly. I think the most famous automotive tariff, maybe one of the most famous tariffs overall, is what's referred to as the chicken tax. And a lot of people are really familiar with it, but basically, in a really short summary, as short as I can, in the years following World War II, the US was kind of gradually flooding the European market with affordable chicken. And they were grabbing around half of the European poultry market. Europe didn't like that. They were trying to rebuild their agricultural industry. So they responded with tariffs, minimum import prices, which, as you would expect, resulted in a dramatic reduction in US poultry exports. So the US responded with tariffs. And they weren't just aimed at Europe, but They were actually global. And coincidentally, they were massive 25% tariffs, not just on starches and brandy, but also on light trucks. So some automakers did eventually become savvy and find sometimes comical ways to get around the rules that were associated with tariffs. But the short and medium term implication really was just the removal of products from the market. At that time, one of the most notable removals from the market was the Volkswagen Type 2. So essentially, import pickups were no longer price competitive. That's what will happen when you impose tariffs. The long-term implications, the sort of inadvertent side effects are numerous. Like, I mean, they're limitless, really. But perhaps the most obvious consequences we're seeing now from that ruling in the 60s is the location of pickup truck production. Nissan Titan, Toyota Tundra, Honda Ridgeline built in Alabama, Nissan Frontier in Mississippi. And another long-term consequence we see is that there's plenty of global truck options that just simply aren't available in North America. Volkswagen Amarok, Mitsubishi Triton, Mazda BT50, because they can't be priced competitively without a local factory. So really, this does go well beyond just the nature of import brands at this point. I think we know that that really there are short-term implications that really don't have any positivity. They are pretty well all pain. So TD Economics just came out with a study in the last day or today showing that Canada sends 1.5 million autos to the US every year. Some of them are bestsellers. Many of them are actually bestsellers in their category. And it's not as simple as just adding production like we've already been talking about. At Honda's Indiana plants, for instance, you can't just take Honda's Canadian production and add it to their plants south of the border that are already running at over 90% capacity. If you wanted to replace all the offshore, this is TD Economics saying this, if you wanted to replace all the offshore production and bring it into the US, it would cost $50 billion before you've even started to talk about the parts. So to use a specific example, Canada last year built 165,000 Lexus RX and NX SUVs, like Scott was already mentioning. Two of America's best-selling premium brand utilities. You want those to be imposed with a 25% tariff. The price goes from 50,000 to 63,000, assuming all things being equal. But again, it goes well beyond import brands. Stellantis imports over 40% of their vehicles into the US, GM 30%, Ford 25%. So essentially, you can't just look at the chicken tax and use that as an effective history lesson. You can't just say, look at all the production in the US and the profitability of full-size pickup trucks without considering the fact that that was a 61-year nature of that system. In the short term, tariffs are pain, either from the higher prices or from the lack of competition and the knock-on effects of that. The chicken tax consequences that we see now, good or bad, are only in effect because it's a long-term economic construct around which plans can be made, and not something that was mused about in a late-night, last-minute remark posing as potential policy.
So keeping with that historical context theme, Tim, how about the notion of affordable Chinese-built electric vehicles being sold in Canada and the United States? Do we have a comparable of that? Is there something in history that we can look at and say, this is possibly what would happen if they did come into our markets?
I don't pose as a history teacher, but I do like some automotive history like this. Change doesn't happen overnight, right? So I think when we talk about, let's say there wasn't 100% tariff on Chinese cars coming into Canada. One example would be the fact that if you look at something like minivans took over the market in many ways. They didn't gain all their market share overnight. They didn't lose all their market share overnight. They were decades-long trends. But I think a more pertinent example would be probably something like Hyundai and Kia. If we're talking about Chinese EVs coming into the country, Hyundai and Kia now own 12% of the Canadian market. Last year was the best year ever for the Korean brands. I'm not suggesting that it took 40 years for Hyundai to become a major factor. Hyundai was actually a really major factor, as some of you would remember, temporarily with one model, the Pony, that they launched in '84. It was $5,795, and it became a bestseller almost instantaneously. It was the best-selling import car almost instantaneously. It was the best-selling car overall within a year. The Pony was not subjected to an 11.5% import duty. Some of its competitors were. Two of those competitors are major factors in Canada, or became major factors in Canada. The Civic and the Corolla were built in Canada by 1988. Now, that wasn't just a Honda and Toyota move to respond to an 11.5% import duty. It wasn't just a move to respond to the Hyundai Pony. But the Pony did have advantages. It also had some pretty big disadvantages. My brother owned one, one of which was quality, obviously. So essentially, this story that built up the Pony and built up Hyundai that seemed to be this temporary or this instantaneous and temporary burst, this didn't hold. Less than a decade into Hyundai Canada's efforts, they were already giving up on Canadian production, which was I think it was in Bromont, east of Montreal. Their sales fell 74% between 85 and 93. So even 2 decades in, Korean brands still were just around 5% market share. So I'm not suggesting that Chinese EVs would follow the same path as Hyundai and Kia. I guess what I think sometimes is that people in our corner of the world, of journalists and analysts and industry insiders, we follow the industry's evolution so closely that we sometimes think that some of this stuff happens overnight, when in fact changes unravel really, really slowly. So could China, subtract 100% tariffs, could Chinese EVs grab 3 or 4 or 5 or 10% market share in Canada? I think they could, but not tomorrow, not next year, certainly not the year after that. An industry overhaul like that takes time to unravel and would probably occur not just in an even trajectory, but probably in fits and starts.
Yeah, that's great insight, Tim. Thanks for that. Okay, Joe, the United States is threatening to impose tariffs on, well, just about everybody. China, Mexico, us. What is going to be the effect on US consumers when it comes to walking into a dealership to buy a car if these things come to fruition?
So if I have to write it in press, I'm going to use the words cautiously optimistic. If I have to be reality statement, I think there's not going to be a tariff. I think level heads will proceed. The US and Canadian economies are so tightly integrated with all the examples that Tim gave and Scott gave. And, there's too much to lose. But I think the idea here was, look, we can't just put our laser focus on Mexico. Let's just hit both our business, our border partners, and see what happens. And complain about the 10 people that cross from Canada bringing fentanyl and the billions of coming across from Mexico. Let's say, hey, let's put you in the same bucket. So I personally think that it's going to be insulated. I think people will get into committees. They'll talk about it. There's going to be some wins and losses. Trump's going to have to take, look, I need 51% of the win here. So I can tell my U.S. The people voted for me here. We got a little bit of a win here. But I'm feeling very optimistic about the relationship with Canada and United States staying in the lane it's going to stay. Look, what it does really is it puts a lot of uncertainty on people that want to plant a flag in Canada. That's where we see the problem. Hey, if Canada wants to bring in new vehicle manufacturing and they don't want to constantly get overflow of vehicles that are built in other states or in Mexico, Oshawa, things of that nature, how do you get your own unique brand? How does Canada get their own manufacturer that Canada is the only place, where the Edge was the only place that was built? And now it's not, and now there's no more Edge anymore, right? And now they're trying to figure out what's going to happen with Oakville. Was it a 3-road Explorer? That's dead. Is it going to be a hybridized F-Series? Who knows, right? There's a lot of uncertainty. That's the biggest problem we have with these threats. Where's the next dollar going to be invested in? When the next dollar comes to North America, people are going to say, yep, I'm going to find a way to say, I'm going to look at the U.S. first because I'm too fearful that something's going to overnight say, nope, now we are going to find a way to punish a Canada or a Mexico going forward. But yeah, we think the tariffs are a mistake right this second. I want to dovetail real quick on what Tim said about the Chinese. The Chinese, from our perspective, don't care about money. It's market share. I mean, let's be frank about it. The Germans at Volkswagen decided that we're going to do something about this diesel to get U.S. market share. If we get caught later, so be it, right? To us, it's 100% tariff. That's a joke to the Chinese. They just want to gain market share. They will lose money on every vehicle if they were. Now, you call them a foreign entity of concern. Okay, that's a different bucket you put them in. But if it's just a monetary perspective of how are we going to penalize them on the wallet, it's a joke to them. They just want to come in, plant their flag. The Pony's a great example. How do we get a vehicle in there, whether it was a bad vehicle or not? Look at Hyundai and Kia today, right? They found a way in and they expanded on that relationship. That's the real play. We got to look on the Chinese, not is it cheaper or more expensive than its competition right here.
Yeah, they play the long game. I mean, that's their history, isn't
right.
it? Well, I love to hear the positive attitude about no tariffs. Scott, I mean, you guys are planning, as you said, years ahead to build cars. The prospect of tariffs, while still very up in the air, must be something you guys are talking about around the boardroom table right now. What I mean, in a worst case scenario, how does that affect a manufacturer like Toyota building cars in Ontario?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. It depends on what you're talking about. If you're talking about, for instance, a 25% tariff, and Joe, I think, just covered that very well. That's unmanageable. We don't have 25% margin in our vehicles. I would argue that applies to the US and Canada in that scenario. It's not just us. So I'd say, and I agree with Joe, that I don't think it's entirely realistic. And I say that because Canada will certainly respond. They've been very public about that over the last few days. They'll target, specific U.S. industries, extract some pain from American consumers, and then you're in this situation where you're almost in a path of mutually assured destruction, right? And where we're punishing each other on both sides of the border. But ultimately, what problem are you trying to solve? And, Tim referenced the TD report that came out over the last couple of days, has pretty good data in it. But, from an overall balance of trade point of view between US and Canada, there's different sources, but using the US's own data, it's around $40 billion. You take away energy, which Canada exports a lot of energy in the United States, and the US actually has a trade surplus of goods into Canada. The US also has a surplus in manufactured goods. And if you look at automotive, automotive goods, that includes vehicles and parts, it's almost that perfect parity. So what problem are you trying to fix there? And, I will highlight that yesterday, actually, the Wall Street Journal, published an article saying that, the incoming US administration wants to head straight into, a renegotiation of USMCA, or CUSMA, as we call it in Canada. And, when I read that, I thought, well, there's the rub. That's ultimately what we're talking about. I think we need to stop being focused on, big numbers and dates that are in the near future, and just understand that we're in a negotiation. Getting back to your original point, Andrew, we don't make long-term investments considering a short-term political cycle. So if companies decide to invest billions of dollars somewhere making something, they're really thinking in 20 or 30-year terms.
Right.
They're not thinking about 2 or 4 year cycles. So obviously it's something that we have to keep our eye on. Obviously it can be concerning, but I think the president of Mexico was quoted yesterday saying we just need to keep a cool head at the moment. I think that's good advice for everybody.
Right. Well, again, I like the optimism about the tariffs. David, you're a little more pessimistic. You believe they are coming. The question being, will they be between 10 or 25%? Are there any aspects here that we haven't touched upon about tariffs?
Yeah, I really am going to be the pessimist on the panel, and I'm disagreeing with experts when I'm only a journalist. I'm treading onto scary ground. I feel like I'm in quicksand. The reason for that is there's a paper I just wrote by Hudson Bay Capital by a guy named Stephen Mirren, who just happens to be I think, chairman or nominated for chairman of the Economic Council for Trump going forward. He has Mr. Trump's ear. And the paper basically contradicts everything that we've heard about tariffs. In other words, the theory on tariff is that American consumers will pay a penalty for the tariffs that we put on Canada. We ship them a car, the cost goes up, the American importer of that car has to raise the price accordingly, and Americans have to pay more money for the same product they were buying before the tariffs were imposed. Mirren says no. Mirren says that if we're forceful on the tariffs and then threaten to retaliate to any retaliation for them, what will happen is that the economy, our Canadian economy, will deteriorate, and our exchange rate with the States will drop by almost exactly the same as the tariff increase. So if we have a 10% tariff increase, our dollar will drop 10%. If we have a 25% tariff increase, our dollar will drop by 25%. He cites some example from 2018 with China as proof of this. But basically, he puts a 25% tariff on cars coming from Canada, but since the price of that that we get for that car drops by 25%, the American consumer doesn't pay any more for that car or truck. In other words, it's possible, I'm not sure if it's likely, that he's convinced Trump that there will be no penalty to the American consumer if he puts tariffs on. Now, that sounds crazy. A little bit to me, but even crazier is it's where the escalatory tariffs he's threatened, where we'll start at 10 and go up. His idea is that if we retaliate with equivalent, they retaliate by increasing even further. And if it eventually we keep upping our retaliation, they threaten things like defense and other contracts, and even pulling out of NATO. That's possibly where some of the pulling out of NATO is coming from. In other words, we'll abandon you on the defense side if you don't just suck it up and absorb these tariffs. So I'm not sure that we should count on logical and rational thought from this new administration. I mean, I take them much more at face value. As I've said already once, the laws and the rules and the executive's orders I've seen written are a far cry from the shotgun approach that we saw in 2016. It was just nilly-willy. They were poorly written, poorly crafted. They were nonsensical. I'm not sure I agree with them, but the current policies are much better crafted. And again, I want to say it again, there's a possibility that they believe that they can put tariffs on us and it won't cost the American consumer a cent. And that is always the strike or the negative aspect of putting tariffs on other countries. If that goes away, there's simply no penalty for Trump to impose tariffs on us. I'm not sure it'll happen, but I think we should know about this.
Okay, well, that's great. Thank you. So we're going to go to reader questions now. We got a ton of reader questions, so thank you all. Obviously, we can't get to all of them. We've got about 13 minutes left here, but we're going to start with Cole. It's actually two readers, and it's kind of the same question. One more specific. Cole asks, is it feasible for Quebec to reach its EV sales goal in the timeline they have put forth? While Michael asks, given we are getting closer and closer to the deadline for major electrification, that being the mandate date, how long do you see pure ICEs continuing? David, why don't you take a shot at this one?
It all depends on what happens in both cases. If both incentives go away for forever and EV mandates go away as well, well, the concept that we're going to be, somewhere between 40 and 60% by 2028 or 2030 is right out the window. That isn't going to happen. If the EV mandate stays and there's no incentives, that's going to be really difficult to say, because the smart way to deal with that, if you're an automotive company, is to simply restrict the number of sales in the area that is got the quota. In other words, if you have to have 50% of your cars are EVs and you're not selling enough, well, then you just sell less ICEs and you could still have reach the quota and not be penalized for it. What that'll do is drive the price of cars way up. So if there's an EV mandate and no EV incentives, then I'd tell you that overall sales in Canada are going to go down, and the sales will be close to whatever the EV mandate says. If it's not, if there's no EV mandates and there's no EV sales, other than Quebec and Ontario, which will maintain their EV mandates, I suspect we'll get to maybe by 2030, maybe 15 to 18% BEVs, and the rest will be a smattering of plug-in hybrids, and ICEs. Let's hope that, as Joe has said, that more of those will be PHEVs and regular hybrids than just pure ICEs.
Okay, well, there's a good prediction for everybody. This one's for you, Joe. This is from Mike, and it's a very specific product question. He asks, when will other manufacturers have a compact truck to compete with Ford's Maverick?
Great question. So Tim already hit on the chicken tax issue. So that's a big problem. I mean, when the Ranger was built in Thailand and they said, well, we're actually going to sell these things in North America, let's bring it here. You know, the general rule of thumb is if you can sell 50,000 vehicles of something, don't import it anymore. Bring it here to produce it. The only thing we see close are basically two products in Brazil, which means they can't be sold here because of the chicken tax. The Ram Rampage and the Chevy Montana are probably the closest ideas of non-Ford products to go against the Maverick. I mean, the Maverick has an EV on its target, or at least a hybridized version coming out, and more that direction too. Yeah, that is a space that they sort of own. It's not a massive amount of volume, but if you look at their penetration rate of how well they're doing with it, they're doing very well with it. So right now we have nothing in that. If I had to guess of products that don't exist today, you know, maybe Hyundai and Kia want to start playing in that space and start bringing a small pickup truck into that realm. Yeah, nothing is a direct threat. Nothing is really built in volume elsewhere they can bring in. So two Brazilian products are the best we can do in terms of answering that question in today's product set. Now, we did have information that I think Stellantis does want to come out with a more mid-sized truck to come to this space. Again, it's going to be more of a Ranger fighter, let alone not a Maverick fighter. But it's an interesting place to be in. I mean, if you look at trucks right now, the Ranger is the size of the F-Series back in the 90s. I mean, everything's just gotten bigger and bigger over time. So, but, you know, long story short, I think that there really isn't a huge competitive market right now from others in that space against Maverick.
Yeah, that's a great answer. It's the global market is obviously ripe for these kind of vehicles, but North America, it's still, we like them big. So that's kind of how it is until that Maverick sales growth goes. No one's really going to jump in there just yet. Right. Okay, Scott, this is not a prediction. This is actually, I'm going to go to my phone here because this question just came in from Mark. Mark asks, what specific technologies have car manufacturers put in their cars since 2020 to reduce auto theft, which obviously is a big problem in Canada?
Yes, and it's a complicated question. Auto theft, a lot of things contribute to that in Canada, and we have a unique environment in Canada where cars are being stolen, certain models being targeted, and that's not happening in the United States. So people are focusing on models and technologies. We're successful in overcoming that in other jurisdictions. It's not happening in Canada. So you've got products, you've got technologies to protect or prevent against theft, and then you've got you know, the environment that they're operating in. And you know, people are pretty aware, if you're reading the news in Canada, what models are being targeted. To address your question, I don't think it would be in my interest to speak publicly about specifically what we're doing on any particular model, because then we're broadcasting, you know, what we've done, and then we're sharing a particular vulnerability. What I would say is that model by model, we're deeply aware of the problem. We are working on technological solutions. I won't get into specifics, but if you were to look at specific models that we sell that have been targeted over the last 3-4 years, you'll actually see a lot of peaks and valleys in the sense that we are implementing technological solutions that are effective, but eventually, unless you address the root cause of the theft, which is frankly criminals, you're going to have that issue over time, where you're going to have, you know, solutions that are effective, but over time they get overcome, and then you're just in an endless cycle. That doesn't mean that we're deterred. We're still working on, theft prevention countermeasures model by model. And I think you'll see more of those coming into place over the next year.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, Tim, you're the numbers guy here. Zson asks, where do you see EV adoption proceeding over the next few years in Canada?
I mean, it's a good question. It's obviously we've talked a lot about no crystal balls, and I certainly don't have one either. I think that the easy and believable and correct answer is I don't know. I think that we're now in this new phase where we don't just need to see how like a cookie crumbles. We need to see how many, many, many boxes of cookies all crumble at the same time. And we need this dust to settle, and the dust isn't settling, and it's going to be difficult to see that. I think we're confident in saying that there remains an EV market at the upper echelon. EVs, high power EVs are well constructed well suited to owners with multiple vehicles in the garage. And I think there remains this bandwidth, this scope for affordable EVs that we haven't really seen yet in this affordable car market that's basically been vacated in Canada. So I think that what we're seeing in response to this disappearance of incentives recently is that we're going to see the core EV market, at least in the short term, collapse to a significant amount, especially outside of Quebec. This is the interesting thing. Outside of Quebec, EV market share in 2024 was just 6%.
Well, British Columbia, sorry to interrupt, but British Columbia was near Quebec also.
Right. So I guess what I mean is in Canada, excluding Quebec, EV market share was just the 6%. I could see that quickly falling in the short term to levels like we would have seen 2021, which is about half that at 3%. The other interesting component of this is that outside Quebec, hybrid market share is now at 10%. That's nearly 4 points ahead of EVs. So I think this is where we can expect to see the big movement, because now hybrids can take advantage of these circumstances that have suddenly become a whole lot less favorable to EVs and PHEVs.
Okay, well, we're going to do a lightning round here. We've got about 4 minutes left. So each of you keep your answer very short. It's a very simple question. First aspect, will Chinese EVs come to Canada? And if so, in what year? Let's start with you, Tim.
2031.
Okay. David?
If the 100% tariff stays, they won't come.
What if the tariff goes away? What if we need affordable EVs to reach a mandate?
If we maintain an EV mandate, no incentives, and we take away the tariffs, they'll be here on Tuesday.
Will they do well, do you think?
Extremely well.
Okay, because of the affordability aspect.
If you have a mandate, you're forcing people to buy vehicles. If there is nobody else but them that has a vehicle that addresses the low end part of that mandated market, then they're going to get all of that mandated market. So it's not rocket science.
Okay, Joe, maybe not for Canada. Well, I mean, you'd certainly do research in Canada. What about the States? What about North America? If Chinese EV comes, when and what year?
We still have BYD producing in 27 in Mexico. Right this second, we have not taken that out of our plan. A lot of this conversation has been light vehicles. We haven't talked about buses yet, and there's a lot of BYD buses ripping around the streets, right? So there is this optics out there that China's going to build their visibility of their products, maybe use larger vehicles like buses and heavy duty, and then bleed that in. So yeah, I'd say 2030, but I would get aggressive, and it could be even sooner than that, post 2027, if BYD does plant their flag in Mexico.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Scott, I know this is a bit of a difficult question for you. I won't say politically, but you do work for a manufacturer. So do you want to answer it?
My answer would be no. I don't think that they will be sold unless something structurally changes in the short to medium term. But I would argue that the tariffs are actually a temporary solution to that problem. And I would also argue that I think they will be regulated out of the marketplace. And specifically in the United States, but also in Canada, there's concerns about electric vehicles connecting to grid infrastructure. And I think the solution to that problem will be regulated. And it will not be a long-term tariff. I think tariffs are really a short-term issue.
Right. So kind of the Huawei of the world. Canada obviously ceased operations of Huawei for security reasons, and that's another question with the Chinese vehicles. Well, fascinating stuff, gentlemen. As usual, the hour has flown by. We really covered a lot of ground. I'd really like to thank our 4 guests for taking time out of their busy schedules to share their knowledge, insights, and to making a few bold predictions on the future of the automotive industry. Maybe we should circle back in 2030 and see how many of these came true. Be sure to tune in to the next Driving into the Future panel on Wednesday, February 12th, which will be hosted by David Booth, and the topic will be the state of battery technology. Very interesting. And as always, it is free to sign up for. For your dose of all things automotive, be sure to check out Driving.ca, where you'll find the best in breaking news, videos, and reviews. You'll also be able to link to a recording of this session at Driving.ca. This panel is made possible with support from Toyota. We thank them. And a big thank you to Van Valkenburg Communications for making this production possible. They are real pros. And finally, thanks to you for joining us. Until the next time.